Good morning. I have just woken up. I often have these dreams where two opposites become one. It's like P and not P is true, like this logically contradictory statement is true, which is axiomatically false in traditional logic. Like it snows and it doesn't snow, or I exist and I don't exist, or that like more philosophy of mind type, everything is quantitative or qualitative. Actually, these I haven't had in dreams, although I think that quantitative and qualitative are not exclusive. But in dreams, what is it that I experience this contradictory statement being true? The feeling is, it has this what William James calls noetic quality, that it's the subjective sense of certainty is like extreme. It feels so real that it feels like everything has latched onto its place. It's like the puzzle has finally been solved. Everything makes sense. And often when I get this insight in the dream, it's I can't say whether it's ineffable or not in the dream, because I don't utter it or verbalize it in the dream. I just experience it, just brute experience happening. And then I try to carry it into waking state, this insight, because it's so important. And at some point in the process of waking up, I have it in my hands, this wisdom, and then it just evaporates like water vapor, or like mist when the sun dries it up. But the sense of veridicality remains. It still feels absolutely real. I have the memory trace of it being so real, although I cannot say what is real except for in these general terms, P and not P is true. And now that I think of it, it's very close to what in Zen philosophy they say about this non-duality, about opposites merging into one. And it happens in this meditative state, and the same process is described in when you take psychedelics. I haven't done serotonergic psychedelics, but as I said earlier, we are planning this work trip, and this is one of the aspects that most interests me in the psychedelic trip, this sense of unity. I can sort of see how this experience here now is united. It's just this But what happens in these experiences where you have, well, in the dream, my experience is not like that everything is united or that I'm part of the larger whole, one with the world. It's not that. It's just the merging of the opposites. So it's different. And even when I do these meditations, drum meditations, and I lose myself quite, I can do that, although it's not I that is able to do that. It just happens when it happens, that I lose sense of self. But still, it's not this strongly veridical sense of opposites being true simultaneously. And this resembles this Zen non-duality concept. They call it emptiness, or just this, like I call it. So maybe there are many varieties of this. Well, there are, because this means experience, and experience is different at every moment, but also as these kinds of mystical insights, there are many different kinds. Non-duality is one, and the merging of opposites. Actually, these are related. Of course they are related. When you have non-duality, you have one, which is also in Zen philosophy one term for this, like, ultimate being. I still have my morning coffee. Oh dear, it's so difficult. Non-duality implies one, and what happens in the dream, in my dream, is the merging of the opposite, that is non-duality. And losing self, losing sense of self, is related. It's the non-duality between me and you, between me and this environment. For our survival, we must represent these drums, all these things as distinct from myself. I need to do that, because if I didn't, my survival would be threatened. And this is quite like, there is no nomological or scientific problem in the experience that everything is one, because it happens even in this rubber hand illusion, where you can convince a person that the rubber hand is their own through, like, associating this touch with visual sight. So they are like touching the rubber hand and your own hand simultaneously. You don't see your own hand, so there is this barricade or wall there between. You only see the rubber hand, and they are touching, the experimenter is touching them simultaneously, and then you start to feel that the rubber hand is your own. And the same with phantom limbs, so that you can feel that something is part of your self, when from the objective perspective it's not. But in this, so it would be the same experience, this merging of opposites, non-duality, and merging of self, because self and not self are also opposites, and they merge. So I have had these experiences in dreams. And that experience in the dream, it's different from what I undergo from it, for example, in the drumming state. I would still call it this, like, the brute, non-reflective state of consciousness without any distinct I that is reflecting on the process. But it still strongly appears that they are somehow two different kinds of things, or processes rather. There are really no things. Everything is a constant interaction. Entropy increases, it consumes energy. But Still one final thing to wrap this diary note together, to move to a more analytical perspective. Think of mental combination, or this like panpsychist combination problem. It's exactly about the merging of the opposites, the merging of two into one. How can two become one? It sounds logically impossible. Of course, it's like temporally distinct. First it was two and then it's one. So it's not simultaneously two and one, but sort of it also is. Well, this panpsychist problem of combination, it's called the combination problem, simply. And William James, usually people refer to William James when they are talking about it. William James was the first to bring this up. And then I read this section from James' Principles of Psychology about soul dust. And I still didn't get the combination problem. I have never understood the combination problem because for me as a naturalist, like I believe in natural science, that it's the most accurate picture of reality that we can get. And it's a picture. That's the important point. It's just a picture. So if you think of natural science, well, my opinion, it's not just an opinion, it's also an argument or a philosophical position that we defend in this consciousness as a concrete physical phenomenon. You should read that if you are interested in this, that we wrote with Henka Railo. Science models how experiences are formed. That's the very simple thesis. It's the job of science to explain how experiences are formed, and you can model experiences scientifically as, for example, neural correlates of consciousness, these empirically observable processes that are completely isomorphic, structurally isomorphic with the experience, so that every change in the experience corresponds to a change in the model, theoretical model, and every time this neural correlate occurs, also the experience occurs. It's always necessary and sufficient condition for the experience. And we have, no matter what some people say, there is vast amount of empirical evidence that experience is a neural process, and it's not just a correlation. I want to emphasize this because some people say that you cannot infer identity from correlation. It's not just correlation, because in science we separate between correlative studies and experimental studies. In experimental study, let's take an example. Imagine that you go into the fMRI tube, this device that detects your neural activation patterns, and whenever you imagine playing tennis, your motor cortex activates. Whenever you imagine the floor plan of your house, your visual cortex activates, and these two activation patterns can be distinguished. And you can voluntarily, so this is mental causation in the most trivial and fundamental sense, you can voluntarily produce those images of neural activation in the fMRI device. So this is experimental evidence, because you yourself manipulate this so-called independent variable, and what is seen in the fMRI device is the dependent variable. And you could boost this up by taking many more participants, and this would be experimental evidence that that your consciousness, what you are thinking about, causes the neural activation patterns that the researcher sees on the monitor of the fMRI device. So it's not correlated. We have all reasons to believe that experiences are neural processes. Then there are caveats related to extended cognition and so on, but and I'm sympathetic towards extended mind. And that actually brings us back to this main topic, that is non-duality, or how two can become one. My cat is looking at me like if she wants something. Do you want something? Just attention. We all need attention. Maybe that's why I'm sitting here speaking to you. I'm so glad that you are listening to me, whoever you are. Do you want to introduce yourself, Kat? No. So, sorry, interruption. How does two become one? This mental combination problem that the panpsychists usually face, although I have never understood what the problem really is. Well, I do. It's got to do with the Russellian panpsychists' notion of intrinsic properties which are non-relational. So this is so obvious. How can you combine non-relational properties? Because if you combine them, they become related. And the Russellian panpsychists say that phenomenality, what an experience feels like, it's part of the intrinsic nature of the neural correlate. But how on earth can the neural correlate have some intrinsic, that is non-relational nature? Because the neural correlate is a process of interaction. Multiple neurons or neural coalitions interacting in a recurrent process, as far as we know currently. The same thesis is made by global workspace theory and integrated information theory, so even they agree about this. It's recurrent activation. So, but that's about that. Russellian monism faces these problems because it separates phenomenal properties from those properties that science models. It's property dualism, and it leads to all these problems that the dualism faces with mental causation. Qualia become epiphenomenal if you dissociate them with the properties that science models, the structural, relational, dispositional properties. So I would say that the properties that science models as dispositional or structural and so on, the properties themselves that are modeled are what we call phenomenal. So there are no two distinct classes of properties. It's the same property observed from the outside or in itself. Or rather a process. If you have A and B interacting with each other, so the Russellians would say that A and B both have their intrinsic nature. I would be silent about that. You can only focus on the process of interaction between A and B. But then you have C, the human observer, and the triad, the tree forming an interaction process again. So you can have the A and B interacting independently of the human observer C. The interaction is what it is, independently of and beyond how it's observed. But so this is all related, of course, to the mental combination problem. But I was trying to be concise here. So how do two become one? And I said it's the job of neuroscience, empirical science, to explain how that happens. So how does science explain that? For example, if you have hydrogen and oxygen and you combine them in the right way, you get water. And I think this is, you might say it's trivial, but I think it's utterly unbelievable. You have two distinct things, hydrogen and oxygen, and the two become one. How is it possible from two to become one? And when I think of it in this way, I sort of understand what William James meant by saying that mental combination is impossible. So it might be just two becoming one. Or you think of like sperm and egg becoming one, and then you have a child. That's unbelievable. And then you have a human being, an interaction process with billions of cells. It's a constant process of maintaining homeostasis, and we consume energy doing that. But still we are one. How can many be one? I think these are the kinds of philosophical questions that are really simple, that you only need to stop and wonder about them. How can many be one? And the same applies to when you have many neurons and they form an experience. And for example, when you have a neglect patient, they have hemispatial neglect and they get a stroke in this, I never remember all these neuroscientific details, but when you get this specific kind of lesion, you can lose 1/2 of your perceptual field. You lose half of your world, but in most of the patients, they don't notice that they have lost half of their world. So they like partly die subjectively and they don't notice it, because how could you notice that you die? Because then the dead part is no longer existent, so that it cannot be thought of, because you cannot think of something that doesn't exist. Because if you would exist, if you could, so this is really difficult. When you have the person with hemispatial neglect, and you ask them to draw a clock, and they try to fit all the numbers on one side, the other side is empty. If they are thirsty and you give them water, if the water bottle is in the blind field, they don't drink it. They cannot. There are certain blind side exceptions to this. But anyway, and they don't see the bottle, so they cannot miss their lost perceptual field, because they don't know it doesn't exist. Because to imagine that something doesn't exist is to imagine the negation of something, and to imagine a negation of something is to imagine also that something simultaneously. So if you imagine a negation of consciousness, like dying, losing consciousness, you cannot imagine that, because imaging happens in your consciousness. So, or take a person who gets a stroke and loses all color vision, like they become completely like monochromatic. These persons are different because they sometimes remember something, like the feeling, the pleasure that they got from the colors. One patient couldn't eat anymore with their eyes open because the food looked so disgusting. So somehow the basic hedonic value remained there, that it affected the hedonic value, but so it's different. But with the neglect patients, they often don't know what they are missing. But I become drifting here again. So how do two become one? Or this, like what I had in the dream, of the merging of opposites. I said it's the job of science to explain how this mental combination happens. But still there is the sense of mystery. If you just think of hydrogen and oxygen forming water, H2O, you could think of it as a constant interaction between the atoms. And the interaction process is what water is. This is called weak emergence. When you have these two combining into one, the one that emerges has also emergent properties. You can drink water, but you cannot drink hydrogen or oxygen separately. You can try, but it might kill you. So I would say, along Whitehead, now I feel that my mind is becoming really empty. You could say, following Whitehead, that every time something interacts, two things interact, they form a novel process. Do you want to come here? Hello. I try to wrap up. Now I must. The cat came here. The cat and me, we are separate animals, but we are interacting. And to the extent that we are interacting, we form this emergent process. So I have been thinking in these drum meditations, or even when we play with the band, like real music, sometimes it feels like I lose myself and the band has a mind of its own. And also when I play with Franz, my friend, these drumming sessions, it feels like the process, there is just the process, the one, and no distinct entities in the process. So it feels like the process has emergent consciousness and I'm part. No, I'm not part of that consciousness, because there is no longer two or many, there is just one. So somehow I'm part of that whole, even though I no longer exist in and of myself. So what I'm trying to say here is really trivial. Take this cup here. And you are now part of this experiment. You there. So stay alert. We do an experiment. So I close my eyes. You can verify that the cup exists. The problem is that I feel it still. But you can verify that the cup exists visually for you. It doesn't exist visually for me. Now I will think of the cat. Like my whole consciousness is just image of this cat. Okay, what's the point with this, you ask? Now when I opened my eyes, I see the cup. What is it to see the cup? It's this, again, like they say in the Zen. For you there, you are the third person here, third person objective perspective. You saw what happened. This happened. I had my eyes closed. I see this faint redness through my eyelids. Then I open my eyes. You see, I open my eyes and I see the cup. For my own part, It was just the experience that changed. I must stop. There are some weird sounds coming from upstairs. The kids are watching cartoons. No, I try to wrap up. It's so difficult. It's so difficult, but so simple at the same time. What I'm trying to say that this combination of many into one happens already in this perception. When you have been looking at this video here, this, what is happening here, and the traces it leaves on the memory of the cell phone and on YouTube servers when I upload it, this process affects you when you see the pixels, the information produced by this process here. When you see it on your own screen, it affects your consciousness, and to the extent that we interact, we become one. But that's not the case, because becoming one requires recursive interaction. That is like, you would have to also affect me. And now it doesn't have it happen because you are there causally isolated. You cannot affect me now because I'm in your past. Greetings from the past. Now, for two to become one requires this recurrent interaction. Here. In predictive coding, there is evidence that if my eyes weren't making these microsaccades all the time, I wouldn't see this. So the cup is affecting me, and I affect my perception of the cup by making these microsaccades and touching it. So we form a recurrent process with the cup, and when we drum with the friend, we form this recurrent process. And we become one to the extent that we form this integrated recurrent process. And you could model it maybe in terms of integrated information theory, like this Tononis and colleagues. I have to ask my friend Robert what he thinks. We have been discussing this, and with Francesco, whether a band could form an emergent consciousness, or whether in a trivial sense, my consciousness is now the process of this cup and me interacting and this whole environment. I consider this as quite plausible. If, with a cat for example, I just perceive it now and she hears me, but if we were somehow combined, like our brains were combined, and the information flow would increase, we would become one to the extent that we are combined. In the same way as conversely, in the neglect patient, when they lose part of their brain so that it becomes causally detached, then the one is divided into two or diminished. In split brain patients, it can maybe happen, at least according to some researchers, that it's actually two minds in one body. But I don't know about that so much. But I think it's essentially this simple. I see the cup. Me and the cup are this one process here, and you can see that this process is my body and my brain, if you could see it. This process in the brain interacting through the motor nerves and through the visual system with the cup. So there is no non-arbitrary boundary between what is external and what is internal. That's my point now here. There is no non-arbitrary boundary. And when I talked to this Robert Cisquire and Francesco Elia, who work on IIT, integrated information theory, they tried to answer why the cup doesn't is not literally part of my consciousness, or why the band doesn't form this emergent consciousness. And they said that the other players are not part of the main complex. I have to ask, maybe I will discuss this with them over Zoom and record it. But this was only for myself to reflect, and I started with the bloody dream of many becoming one, and I ended up in this mental combination. Well, it's the same thing. Many becoming one, but you never know what is beyond the one that is you, the one that is this. Because you cannot know anything of not this, that what is outside, that what is not your consciousness. Like the neglect patient cannot know anything in their blind field. And this happens all the time, this mysterious mental combination. It happens now. My existence is this combination, the process of interaction between several neurons, several neural coalitions. This interaction happening, that is my existence, my consciousness, this modeled from the external perspective. But from the inside, because the process cannot have an external perspective to itself, it just exists. It just is or happens. So the process itself cannot know that it's a process. If A and B interact, that interaction process itself doesn't know, cannot know that it's an interaction process between A and B. How could it, unless it had a mirror that shows it what it's composed of? And we have these mirrors, neural imaging devices and so on. But my main point is that it happens all the time, this many becoming one. Like Whitehead says, this world is this unfolding process of, this leads to holism, that like it's a vast, infinite world, because everything that I interact with right now is a new, genuine process. When I look in that direction, it's one process. When I look in that direction, it's another process. Now I need to go.